A very good morning to all our dear listeners and viewers. Welcome to ACFIM Talks on this 24th of September 2021. It's a cold, rainy morning. And with me in the studios, I have the Executive Director for Dialogue and Democracy Training Center, Henry Kasacca, who is joining us for a very interesting discussion. We are taking stock and reviewing the 2021 general elections. These are about 8 months since we cast. Are they 8 months? Probably 8 or more than 8 months, coming to 9 months since we cast the ballot and decided the leaders for the next 5 years. You are most welcome, Henry Kasacca. I can't hear you. I think your phone is, I think you are either muted. Try to unmute. Wow, I can't hear Kasacca. Geoffrey, can you help us get the connection up? I simply can't hear what. I don't know. I can't hear. I can't hear what Henry is saying. Henry, can you hear me? Yes, you can hear me. I can't hear you. Geoffrey, can you help us work out the sound? As Geoffrey works out the sound, I'm hoping Henry, try to unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted.
Okay,
I'm
now
unmuted.
that's better. Great.
Now I can hear me.
Sure,
Great.
I can hear you very well. Yes, Henry Kasacca is the Executive Director, Dialogue and Democracy Training Center. He is also the external trainer at Institute of Parliamentary Studies, and at some point he worked with NIMD. NIMD is Netherlands Institute for Multiparty Democracy. If my memory serves me right, he was among the first team that organized the first iPod. Yeah, so there is quite a very interesting history with Henry and multi-party democracy in Uganda. And I think at some point he also worked with Frederick Ebert Steve Tang. So I think we have the right person to dissect this discussion concerning a reflection and an audit of the 2021 elections that we held, that until now I've left, there are many views or perceptions depending on where you are and which lens you're using concerning how these elections actually were conducted. But I also expect to be joined by Isabella Akiteng at some point. I think she's running late. She is the managing partner of FEMFORT. She also, for many of you, I think you first interfaced with her in this sector when she was working with the Uganda Youth Network. When she gets here, I will introduce her again. But once again, you are most welcome, Henry, to this ACFIM Talks edition.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here.
Okay, my name is Felix Kafuma, the host, and I'll be the one handling this show for the next 1 hour. And let's quickly take it off by just, I know that Electoral Commission has been doing a similar exercise, trying to take stock of how, as a body mandated, how it managed the electoral, the elections of 2021. But I think it's also prudent for us as actors that represent this society, because civil society comes from the society, to also reflect and take stock of what we saw. And I know, Henry, you were really in the middle of a thick and thin of things concerning observing and participating in these elections, not just as just an observer, but you really also moved a number of processes. I remember seeing you during the time when there was that election watch, knew you trying to contribute in that space. But overall, what's your quick take on the 2021 general elections, just to get started?
Well, I think that the 2021 general elections were an important milestone in Uganda's democratization process. and we may have lost some opportunities because of so many factors. This election was largely driven by a couple of issues, some of which happened before the elections, others happened during the elections, and others happened after the elections. We went into this election with many of the challenges and fault lines still existing regarding our electoral democracy. And we went into an election where the political players, particularly the political parties, were having a lot of internal instability. That is in terms of internal conflicts. We had new parties forming up. We had new pressure groups coming up. So there was some kind of internal instability within the elections. We also went into these elections from a background of an amendment to the Constitution, which somehow destabilized all the actors, including civil society. When we had the amendment of the Constitution, many people thought that that was the last time of seeing a peaceful transfer of power. So many withdrew from the whole process, and the participation was quite thin, especially towards the elections. So coming to COVID complicated everything. We had a roadmap that had to be revised. Eventually, people began not debating the pandemic and its impact, but also resisting the pandemic. And also we had all this lack of political consensus on how we are going into this election. But overall, contrary to what was expected, that this was going to be a very violent election in terms of people losing lives, in terms of people beating up each other, this was not the case. We want to say that the incidents of violence were extremely limited in this election, and the confrontations we saw were part of the traditional confrontations between the security forces and the different political players. So those were the incidences that we could see happening throughout the elections. I want to say that this election was also faced with two major critical issues. Is that there was a reality and there were narratives. There were so many narratives around this election. People thought it's going to be driven by young people. People thought that Bobi Wine is going to mobilize the entire voter turnout to go up. So there were so many narratives. The social media created a narrative, and the issue is that many issues were not actually seen in this election. And we have made analysis, and we have made commentary, and we have made conclusions based on the various narratives that were shaped around the elections. So we are yet to have a deeper analysis of those critical elements that were being driven by this election. I want to say, as I end this, is that the fact that we had the constitutional amendment to remove the age limit, so many people withdrawing from this process. The pre-election participation was very limited on the part of the civil society, on the part of the development partners, on the part of the international partners. That's why we even had the EU was not able to have a mission, largely because somehow they moved into making statements that could indicate that they had taken a position on the outcome of an election. So it had so many issues. The narratives that this election was being driven by foreign interests was also very high on the part of the NRM and the president particularly. And of course, you can't rule out the concerns that events elsewhere would have influenced the elections. So I want to say that the political strategies, this election was driven by how the various players were reading the strategies of their opponents. And that became a very critical issue in this election. I think I'll just leave it at that for your
Wow, yeah, that's a very good stage you've set, because there are a couple of things you raised, but let me first pick one, and against which I will write my next question, especially concerning, you refer to the, first of all, the pre-existing challenges that, in 2016, they were not handled, but even in 2011, they were not handled. I think there are issues there. There are some electoral reforms that for a long time have been on the cards, and we walk into this election at the backdrop of unresolved electoral reforms not having been addressed. Let's because when you're talking about the evaluation or when you're analyzing the performance, the review of the 2021 elections, you cannot run away from the legal framework. So to what extent were the underlying gaps or the existing gaps in the legal framework, how did they affect or impact these elections? Looking at especially those recurrent challenges that were pronounced by court in 2016 but not addressed, and then we walk into these 2021 elections with the same challenges. How did that affect, especially the electoral outcomes?
Well, I think to a great extent, the effect was not very visible. I think that many of the reforms that are being suggested are to improve the entire electoral democracy, to allow the institutions to grow, to allow the participation to start early, to allow the Electoral Commission to conduct civic education, to allow all these processes that will definitely give an outcome. So many of the reforms that were not conducted, you will also realize that many of the political actors abandoned electoral reform debates. When we went into the age limit, the debate, the entire country switched and they all abandoned the whole issue of electoral reforms. Electoral reform advocacy declined significantly when we had the electoral age limit amendment in Parliament. Not the donors, the civil society, the political players, everybody jumped onto the age limit as if that was the only factor that was in the country. So to begin with is that 2 years to the elections, as a country, we basically abandoned the whole advocacy for electoral reforms. People would only make commentary in passing about electoral reforms. Yes, we need reforms. The court has said we need reforms, but even the populace did not understand the gist of these reforms. So I think that the dynamics that shaped 2021 were quite different in terms of the energy and the mobilization that was being done. Many of the politicians ran into mobilizing the populace, regardless of whether we had reforms or not. And this is shaped by three factors. I think the Ugandan population or Ugandan political class has defined the context in three frames. There is one group that believes that Uganda is a dictatorship and you can never have an election. And all these processes are to legitimize a dictatorship. And they hardly believe that mobilizing people to register, mobilizing people to check their names is important. So they will always say, we are looking for an opportunity where we can remove the dictatorship. How that comes is another question. Now, the second category are those who believe that Uganda is a hybrid. We have these processes, they are not so stable, they are imperfect, they need to improve, and we should continuously push for advocacy towards improving these processes. Now, this class of people did not have a lot of space in the elections. Now, of course, the other category are those Ugandans who believe that, yes, Uganda is a transition. Despite all these challenges, we are making progress. Despite what happened in 2021, we can still count stock and say Ugandans have made progress. You can still count and say the Ugandans did not fight each other. At a personal level, there was no violence. The people power people, the NRM, the FDC, there were no incidents being reported across the country where supporters of different camps were fighting. And we could say that is a progress. So these three factors dominated the whole process. The idea that people power had come, it had mobilized, it was a wave, it was drawing inspiration from other countries, overtook the whole issue of electoral reforms. So to many politicians, they do not believe that they can't actually attribute the outcomes to the lack of electoral reforms, other than the traditional talk that we did not have the reforms and we did not have the reforms and this is a repeat of the previous elections. So I want to say that whether we had electoral reforms or not, the dynamics and the factors that were shaping this election did not give Ugandans the opportunity to identify that the lack of reforms had impacted on the outcome.
Okay, thank you so much. We have been joined by Isabella Akiteng. Isabella, you are welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
yes, you found us when we've started the discussion. Isabella is the managing partner, if I'm not mistaken, is the managing partner, Femford, and is joining us on this show to discuss a very interesting topic. Already, Henry has made some interesting submissions concerning what he thinks were his perceptions regarding the way 2020 elections were conducted. But let me come to you, and this is where I'm going to throw you at the deep end of, because I'm following up on something just submitted, that the narrative around electoral reforms did not in any way have much influence on the 2021 elections. But let's look at, first of all, in there are things concerning the voter turnout. We know very well that there was a drop, I think by 10%, from 67 in 2016 to about 57% voter turnout. And partly what Henry is saying is that there seemed to be the population debunking from engaging in this process as a result of the Article 102B amendment and the sour taste it left within the populace. But and also the narrative thinking that probably this was the time for the youth to really come up and drive the agenda and the numbers in participating in these elections. But from your end, what is your take when it comes to what could be the factors that may have influenced the drop in the numbers in the voter turnout from 67 to 57?
Thank you very much. And first of all, my apologies. I underestimated the rain and the traffic of today and just fell into the mother of all problems this morning. But I'm glad that I'm able to join finally. On what could have caused the drop? A couple of factors. One of them, of course, could be the COVID crisis, because we cannot take away the fact that there are people who are genuinely afraid to go out. I know of friends and family who said they were not going to go to the polling station because they were not sure that they would be able to guarantee their health at the polling station, that the polling station could have easily been a hub for the spread of the virus, but also for people who are registered to vote outside Kampala or outside the areas that they were staying in. The restrictions on movement. So if you had to go to the bus park, and we all saw what the bus park looked like, that was risky, and yet despite the fact that we had a pandemic, the pandemic did not give us the opportunity to address challenges like that and say, because we have travel restrictions, because we have a virus within our context, is there a way that that people can be able to vote in the areas that they are without becoming super spreaders? And so even that could have caused people not to go out. But there's also the realities of the ever decreasing trust in our institutions as a country, that every day we have more people who are asking, but does my vote count? I will tell you that I and Henry actually happened to sit into one of the leaders' retreats, and I think Henry remembers. And we had a very heated discussion around whether to take part in the 2021 elections as a sector or stay away. So if even the civil society governance space, the space that should ultimately be the one that is pushing for elections, that is pushing for democracy, reaches a place where there's a clear split around whether to go in and do work around the elections or not do work around the elections, is in its way telling. Because if the space which is supposed to be rallying the masses to come for elections is split, it has an overarching impact on the amount of civic education that takes place in the country. So if we have a challenge with civic education, you have new voters wondering if it makes sense to go to the ballots. But also, speaking about civic education, was the amount of investment poured into the last elections. Even donors were skeptical about the last elections. for over a year, donors kept asking, but where do we put our money? You know, no one was sure about where to put the money, or whether it would even have results if the money was put out. So at the end of the day, even the Electoral Commission had limited, should I say, support and allies externally in regard to the provision of civic and voter education to the masses. But even going forward was the whole issue of the securitization of our elections. You know, that we cannot understate the emotional blackmail on the citizenship. When you pour out the military onto the streets, when you pour out the LDUs who are not trained onto the streets, what exactly are you telling the masses? You're telling the masses that they can't trust you. When you have people in high offices saying, we will crush your children, you can't understate the impact of that on people. But also the fact that you had, so beyond the presidential elections, the fact that you had a lot of arrests, you know, also affect. I missed voting because I was in jail. You know, they arrested me on election day, and so I couldn't vote because I was. And there were so many people I met in jail who had been arrested because around election related matters. So and to date we cannot tell how many people were arrested. We cannot tell how many people missed the opportunity to go to the polls on election day and beyond the presidential election day because they had been arrested. And so you have a lot of these factors that caused the turnout to be that low. But also, if you look at the vehicles that we usually use as the civil society sector to push for elections, during the last election we had SEDU. SEDU had its issues, you know, and of course you will begin to talk about how does the sector come together to make sure that there's a critical mass around elections. We had we had the coming up of what is it called now? The name has disappeared. The new you, and then we had new you being banned, and because new you was banned, you had a lot of the organizations under new you under scrutiny, and part of those organizations had their accounts frozen. So you had a lot of human resource also that was pulled back, and you see, if at national level you have that amount of that a lot of, that level of, should I say, of attack at national level, you can imagine how far the intimidation went at local level. So when we say people did not come out, there's an entire story behind behind people not showing up to vote. You know, an entire story. When you look at special interest group elections and you're looking at, for example, persons with disabilities who had to move, has any of us looked at the impact of COVID, but also the impact of all these SOPs on the special interest group elections turnout? You know, have we? If you're looking at the elderly, what is the impact in terms of finances, their access to finance, their access to information, given the fact that this was the first time we were voting representatives for the elderlies, and how how their critical mass was affected in terms of who managed to make it to the polling station, you know? So at the end of the day, there's an entire story behind the story as to why the numbers look the way they look. Over to
Thank you. Thank you so much. A number of questions are coming through. Farida has a question, I think, around provides numbers. We have 18 registered, only 10 turnout vote. I think I'll come back to that question when I engage Henry. There's also been a question around violence that has been raised by Henry, and I think also the question around around why many of them are around the issues of numbers and violence. But let me
and maybe Felix, before you come in, maybe there's just one thing that I missed after seeing Farida's numbers, was the issue of should I say the lost voters in the name of youthful voters who couldn't be registered, the 1 million voters that we lost because the EC had closed the process. So there's also that to consider.
That 1 million, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Now, Henry, let me come to you here. one of the critical things that comes out when one is evaluating this 2021 elections is the context of COVID. How significant was this context, especially in terms of the issues to do with voter turnout, but there are also issues to do with the securitization of the entire process, and how we did disenfranchise majority of the Ugandans? How did COVID play out in this whole debate or narrative?
Well, COVID was a big factor, and it continues to being a very big factor on our entire body politic. Remember, before we went into the elections, all the parties were behind schedule in terms of their internal processes. When COVID came up, they even had to go to Parliament and pass some laws to allow them extend their term of office, to allow them, which were also outside the law. The parties nominated candidates, they extended their terms of office. Nobody knows when their terms of office will expire now, after they had all expired. But I mean, this was part of the big challenge. So COVID took a central stage. All the political activities had to be sanctioned by the district task forces. Now, the district task forces were being chaired by the RDCs. And the RDCs are the appointees of the president. And they were also part of the COVID fight. So to find a link where somebody would honestly make an objective judgment, whether such a rally or a procession through the main city can be accepted, and the EC somehow withdrew from the COVID issues. So we had police enforcing COVID guidelines more than any other person, not even the Ministry of Health. So when the police could stop a candidate from going through a city center, they would say that the task force did not allow him to go through here. But who was in the task force? The task force was chaired by the RDC, and it was all this. So you find that there was a very big impact. And of course, the lack of positive engagement between the government and the opposition, the political parties and the security forces was a big factor. There was always, and this has not started with COVID, it has gone on from the former. We have had some kind of confrontational approach towards engaging, and it's always adversarial, you know. Even when politicians say we are peaceful, but their messages are so adversarial, you know. You feel the fire in them. And when they are speaking in that adversarial manner, those messages, you can't underestimate the impact of those messages on the population. You got people had slogans like Chigwalero, you know. Chigwalero literally means it ends now. There's nothing else. If we can't go through, we have to go through. So all those kind of messages were radicalizing the society. And the nature of engagement between police and the political actors always had that adversarial kind of engagement. Police would say, you can't go here. You call a press conference, you say, we are going. Come rain, come shine. Now, this is in the press. This is being broadcast on social media. This is preparing the country for a showdown. Now, we went into this election, and this is where COVID had a big impact. But it's not just because of COVID. It's because of the nature of adversarial politics that we have been practicing for the last couple of years. So COVID had a very big impact on these elections. And of course, when it comes to the other turn-up issues, and you see, we had a problem. And like I say, that when we passed the age limit amendment, everybody withdrew. Civil society was contemplating, should we participate in this or not?
Or not.
Which means they had taken a position on the outcome because of the age limit. The age limit did not affect the voters. The age limit created was part of our traditional problems. So when we withdrew, even the donors began contemplating where we don't see results. But what results did they want? And this is where the problem comes in. What results did they want? I think the biggest issue is that even those supporting democracy should realize that they are supporting Ugandans. If a process does not work, it does not mean you abandon the whole process. Supporting democracy is a very consuming process. So if we had a challenge with the SEDU, we had people being arrested. We actually took positions that would compromise our standing within the objective assessment. We had to get into all these problems. Now, of course, the other factor that comes in is that the narratives that were being shaped. Many of the civil society groups were being stopped from participating in this process. And if you look critically, it is dependent on the narratives they were shaping. It's not about the Electoral Commission trying to say no, but I mean, if you look at the narratives, when New You came up, what was the narrative of New You? If New You came up and had the baggage of the age limit amendment as part of their motivation, it would extend and compromise how they are going to be looked at by the Electoral Commission. So you find that New You came up, immediately it was stopped. People began falling off and say, no, we have to observe. So you find that all these factors compromised what we had to see. And it comes to the securitization is that we had an election where the Uganda Police Force took on the mandate of enforcing COVID guidelines. We had an elections where the Electoral Commission gave guidelines and was not part of the regulating of those interfaces. In all these cases where we had the challenges in the districts, the district registrar of the Electoral Commission was never part of all those discussions. You would not feel that a statement is being made by the Electoral Commission registrar on the route plan. So actually the Electoral Commission withdrew from designing the whole process. So we had police, the political parties, and all these came from very adversarial backgrounds. But by and large, I would say that despite all these challenges, there has been a progressive advancement of democracy in terms of empowering the people, in terms of having a non-violent population. The fact that despite this election being the way it was, we did not have people fighting each other. We did not have incidents of where no people would go after FDC or NRM would go after DP. And the fears for violence were very high before the election. To me, that is a progressive kind of process. But the problem we had is that many actors wanted to disengage. They judged this election based on the age limit debate. And the fact that President Museveni was on the ballot paper, people believed it was a sham, we could not go through. And that takes us back to the three narratives I said, that there are those who believe Uganda is a dictatorship and the age limit was the last window to have a dictator throne. Others believe Uganda is a hybrid where despite these laws, the practice is different, but we can always improve. Others believe Uganda is in a transition. You know, when you're in a transition, you don't give up each time you fall. You don't give up. Eventually, people will begin appreciating all these factors. So those three narratives were playing in the center. When FDC launched Plan B, even at the eve of the elections, they endorsed Dr. West, Engineer Amriat, and Dr. West, they said, for me, I'm leading Plan B. How Plan B would work out was always a guess. So that also became a serious issue. I mean, even Bobby Wine, if you listen to Bobby Wine's messages, they were always like, it is now time, we are going to overrun this dictatorship. The people have stood up. It has happened in Egypt, it has happened in Sudan, so all these were drawing inspirations from elsewhere. And like I said, that the nature of the strategies that were being implemented by the different actors informed the response from their opponents.
Wow, thank you so much. I don't know where as Isabella has gone, because there's a question I wanted Isabella to respond to that spins off what you've just submitted, because there are about three things that you set in motion. I hope Isabella can connect. Isabella, it's good you're back. There's something that as Henry has triggered that I should bring to your attention concerning the kind of messages that were being traded during the campaign period. And we all know how the messaging and does influence the behavior of the different electoral actors in the process. We know what opposition was trading as their messages, what NUP was trading, what FDC was trading. But this is not very different from the messaging that has been also observed in the previous elections. Why is it that our politics always has those very strong messages that polarize electorate to believe like it's a do or die. This is it.
My response is really around two things.
Yes.
One is that the state has the monopoly over violence. So the state will always set the pace for the violence that we see, whether be it verbal, be it militaristic. The state has the monopoly, and the state can put an end to violence. The state can set the pace for a dignified election. The state can set the pace for dignified conversations within an election. Unfortunately, in our situation, the state chooses to set the pace for violence in voice, in word. It is not the opposition that started saying that they were going to kill our children. That was the state. You get? And so when the state that has power and access to all the military, outfits, if the state has access to all the structures that be, and the very state with all this still has the courage to threaten, what do you leave the opposition with? What do you leave them with? And I know some will say the opposition needs to be better. They need to up their. No. The state holds this monopoly, and the state failed us on that.
So the state sets the tone.
The state sets the tone, and the state set the tone for violence in the last election and has always set the tone for violence in all the previous elections. That's the first thing. The second one is that this country is a traumatized country. For anyone who has gone through a class on trauma and abuse, we are traumatized as a people. And so most of our responses are trauma responses. We suffer from trauma, and it does not help the fact that when COVID broke out, when the pandemic broke out, one of the first victims of the pandemic were the mental wards in national referral hospitals, because the mental units were turned into COVID wards. Okay, so where were we putting everyone who needed to be in that ward, if not in the community? We are a mad society. We have severe mental disorders as a society. We are trauma. It is not possible for you to live in Uganda for 40 years and go through all the elections that we've gone through with all that violence and say you're normal. We all need therapy. We all need to see psychologists. We all need mental assessments. Okay? And so when you talk about the violence and the messaging that seemed to run across, you must remember that you're dealing with a traumatized community. And so trauma manifests itself differently. We cannot run away from trauma in elections. In fact, we need to do a study around how elections traumatize masses. And it does not help the situation that our state is not investing in trauma and mental health. Okay? And so how do you expect people to heal? We cannot be in self-healing mode all the time. And so we laugh at our problems as a people. I was reading an article by, who was it, Taka, recently in The Observer, and he was saying Ugandans cry about their problems because we laugh at our problems because we can't cry about them. We are too disturbed to cry about them, so we laugh. And so those are my two responses to the messaging. That the messaging is a direct trauma response. When people are traumatized, they have patterns of behaviors that come out. Either they relieve their trauma, or they hide from their trauma. And when we're talking about trauma, it's something that this country does not want to discuss. But for example, I keep asking, has anyone done rehabilitation for the people who were in the bush in 1986? Because this thing might have spilled over on us. We are dealing with people who did not ever heal from the war.
That explains some of their behaviors.
It explains the erratic it explains our erratic character and nature as a people. And so we cannot say that this is us. We are traumatized, we are brutalized. Okay? I keep saying that for me it was shocking. For about 6 months, I did not recover from staying in a jail cell for 4 days. Okay? So how about people in the opposition who are in jail cells every month? Have you asked yourself what they are going through?
I think when you go there the second time, you become immune.
No, but you see, that's trauma speaking. That's trauma speaking.
I get your point very well. Yes.
That you assume that you don't self recover. Trauma is not a wound where the scar remains. You would actually need help, which is why Butabika exists. You need help. So one, the state has the monopoly over violence. The state set the tone for violence in the last election with all the messaging that they put out. Number two, we are a traumatized community. We may as well acknowledge it and seek medical help.
All right, fair enough.
Yeah.
You see, maybe Felix, just to add one thing on what Isabella has said, is that, you see, the nature of our society, if a leader comes and they're speaking calmly and they're like, we have to go for election, we shall not allow, if they steal election, we shall go to court.
Like
people will accuse you of being so peaceful, you know?
Yes.
And they expect you to be rough. They expect you to promise fire. They expect you to threaten the monopoly of violence held by the state, by your verbal artillery. And now that is where we have the biggest challenge, is that people will promote that culture, yet they do not believe in it, yet they know it's just, and to me, it's a defeat of leadership. Leadership demands that you have to be able to tell the people where you are and what you can do, and inspire them to do what is within their means. Now, for you to come and promise the people that you are going to overrun this violent regime with your words, that's why it also contributes to voter turnout. There are many people who believe that we have had all these stories. You know, people have been attacking Dr. Besigye. In 2021, in 2001, you told us we vote for you, the rest we leave for you. You'll handle the rest. The army is yours. You didn't manage it. Now, Bobby Wine has come. It is his time. He has mobilized all the youth. The youth are behind him. And I was part of a meeting where somebody was arguing that the youth are determined to see change. Come rain, come shine.
Come shine, yes.
Then somebody told him that the army is determined to contain them. Come rain, come shine. Then the question was, what will be the meeting point of these two forces? The meeting point of these two forces will be extremely destructive to people, to life, and also to the culture of democracy. Isabella was in jail for 4 days, and she had 6 months of recovery. I have talked to people in a police cell when they are looking for bond money, and they are crying literally, saying, Banange, will we get the money? Shall I leave? My children. When they go through that, they cannot be able to be part of that. And that kills the culture of democratic growth. So it is the nature of politics, the abuse of power, and also the weakness in conceptualizing the appropriate response. When people are abusing power, should we also use, one of the messages General Mugisha Muntu is saying is that in 1981, he was motivated to get a gun and change government. But he can never get a gun to change government, however dictatorial it will be. Because when you bring change through that means, you can never have democracy. You have this culture of entitlement continues. And to him, that is what is affecting many of his colleagues with whom they brought democracy using the gun. And he believes that any other person can fall victim. That if Isabella got a gun today and they fought this government out, when they have their gun on the side, Isabella will never be democratic.
It's the only language they understand.
It's the only language. So it is how we are conceptualizing our democratization process. It is the approach we take. And if we think that we can mobilize people on false hope, one of the things people have is that Ugandans are cowards, or Ugandans have seen violence and they're not ready to pay any more price on anything. So they either withdraw or they leave things to go the way they are going. And this is killing the democratic growth in terms of culture. People are withdrawing from even simple things like signing a petition. They believe it will not do anything. When you sign a petition and there is nothing, you give up. But if you sign 3 petitions, if the Right Honorable Amama Mbabazi had not gone to court in 2016, today we would not have a court judgment putting the Attorney General to bring reforms. So if the Right Honorable Mbabazi had not gone to court, the country would not have an important landmark in terms of democratic advocacy. Because in 2020, we were just holding the judgment of Honorable Mbabazi. If Mbabazi had not gone like Dr. Besigye, we would not have anything. Bobby Wine went in 2021. He withdrew. But maybe that judgment would have delivered some milestones. So we must have that culture that we are in a process of building. It's not a one-off event that we are going to deliver it immediately.
Indeed. Democracy, it's a process. Even in US, they have had fair challenges on their democracy, clearly showing you that it's the small steps. Before you come in, Isabella, I want to kind of a bit us look at, let's do a honest audit on Electoral Commission. Joseph Gonza, Farida Lule, and Favored Grace, I'm seeing your comments. I hope we'll have time to kind of respond to them, including the comments coming through, questions coming through from Eddie and Abel. And as well, even the one of Henry, which talked about violence, which I'll unpack later. But before we discuss the question of violence, with a specific question on that, I want us to look at, honestly, how prepared was the Electoral Commission, especially for the 2021 elections?
Well, I think that the commission was prepared under the circumstances. Many of the faults that we saw in the last elections, which were due to lack of preparation, did not manifest. This time round, we had very few cases of voter disenfranchisement. I don't know polling stations where people were going and looking for their names. I think there was an improvement in terms of people showing up and they are not on the register. That one, I think there was an improvement. The other factor
you're discussing on the election day. What about, you talk about during the campaign period and then the actual election day. But also, as we answer that question, the preparation of Electoral Commission also, was it really in charge?
You see, the commission was in charge, but somehow allowed other people to do so many factors. The commission, and this is also another area where we need to look at the legal framework. The commission is in charge of influence of managing the entire election process. Now, we had a pandemic that was being guided by the district task force. Actually, the Ministry of Health had influence on the Electoral Commission. Each time they would say the pandemic is going up, the commission would make the decision. So the influence of those recommendations from the Ministry of Health impacted. I mean, yesterday the president was speaking and he said, we disallowed campaigns in Kampala. But the commission should not be under the command and direction of any person. Not even the president of Uganda should decide on what should happen in an election. It should be the chairman of the Electoral Commission. But from what the president was speaking yesterday when he addressed the country, he said, we disallowed campaigns in Kampala, which means he had an influence in the commission reaching that decision. So all these factors where the commission was put in a position of, we can't gather, you go ahead and organize an election. That factor influenced on their role. The commission was not in charge of enforcing COVID guidelines. It was the police. So the police would come, they are enforcing COVID guidelines. The other ones are campaigning. You remember when Bobby Wine wrote to the Electoral Commission, the engagement between the Electoral Commission and Bobby Wine did not end on any positive, promising process. The commission kept on telling him, you are faulting the rules. I mean, each time he was saying, police is stopping me here, they told him, you are faulting the rules. So even the police, the commission, you remember, wrote to the Inspector General of Police, telling him, we hear you are blocking people, we don't know. Then the police wrote back, please substantiate what you are saying. Now that shows you that the relationship between the police, the Electoral Commission, and the other state actors was not to facilitate what the Constitution envisaged. There were loopholes that were manipulated because everybody was doing their constitutional mandate. The police had to enforce the COVID guidelines, whether you are in elections or not. That one they could not compromise. The commission could not call upon the police not to enforce COVID guidelines because somebody has a right. Now, we went into this election, and where the commission was not able to be put to real test is that the engagement of the actors. We needed to have more stakeholder engagement around elections, where we could raise these issues in a framework that would find solutions, where we could all be part of the solutions. So everybody was just jumping ship. And the commission will actually tell you we are in charge, except those who are faulting the whole process. So we lost out on that. I would say that the commission was in charge legally, but many of the processes would show you that there were factors that indirectly influencing even their own decisions, because you cannot go to the president to consult him
on when to,
and you consult the president, you don't consult the opposition parties. You consulted him as president of Uganda, and when the Ministry of Health said, this is where we are, the commission did not even make any recommendation that under these circumstances it is impossible for us to organize an election according to the standards. We recommend that those in charge change the laws. If they don't, we shall do what we can within the limits. So we did not see the commission raising alarms that under the circumstances it may not be possible to fulfill the constitutional obligations, but that could not come up. So there are so many factors, and COVID, the COVID fight indirectly influenced and took over and lost the commission seeding ground on so many areas where they had to be in charge.
Isabella, do you share the same thoughts? The commission in charge legally, but other factors beyond it to really be fully in charge?
Probably, yes, I agree with him, and also agree with Gonza, who has just posted a message around the conflicting messaging of the Electoral Commission during the pandemic. But just to add more to what Henry said, because I totally agree with Henry. There are things, okay, so if we are to measure, if we are to talk about the Electoral Commission's should I say mandate, it is within the context of the law, the context of what is expected of them. And I think to a large extent they fulfilled their mandate. But there are things, there are loopholes that Henry talks about that they took advantage. One of them was, are we still here? Yes. So
yes.
It was expected that the EC would tell us what sort of technology they were going to be using, especially around the time that they talked about scientific elections. What sort of technology were they going to be using? How was it going to work? Where was it coming from? How was it procured? But up to tomorrow, we
Did I lose you, Isabella? Bit of a network connection. I seem to have lost Isabella.
Within the context and framework.
Okay, she's back.
If we're talking about boosting the functionality of elections through technology, that we are paying attention and trying to make the masses believe that we don't have ulterior motives in as far as the technology goes. When you look at, of course, election day, I'm glad to report, and I do not know, but I received quite a bit of data from around the country before I was taken, that a lot of that in instances where the biometric machines did not work, the returning officers had been instructed that where the machines don't work, they automatically move to manual usage of the voter register. And so a lot of those delays were worked on within that context. Even the issue of violence at polling stations, especially during the voting time, that was something that I believe was worked on better during this particular period of during this particular time through through the time that the elections were held. The one thing that I feel that another loophole that the Electoral Commission probably fell flat on was on the issue of accreditation. If you remember, our accreditation process in 2021 was special. At a certain point, they were only accrediting up-country organizations. There was a weird way in which Kampala-based organizations were not being accredited. The ones that were accredited about 2 or 3 weeks before elections were those that had applied for long-term accreditation. But as we drew closer to the election day, it became clearer that Electoral Commission was not very interested in having this election monitored. And also on election day, long-term observers were accused of not having gotten accreditation from the Electoral Commission, which was problematic. It's actually one of the reasons that the arrests happened. And I know that ACFIM was one of those observers who were told that despite the fact that they had received long-term observer status from Electoral Commission, the Electoral Commission went ahead and said that that observer status did not include election day. And under the sun, I do not know how that works. I don't understand how to have long-term observer status and can't observe on election day. But all the long-term observers were told that they had broken the law by observing elections on election day. And yet, even within that status, the long-term observers are mandated by law to provide a report to Electoral Commission around how elections went on, but the data and the equipment that was used on election day was confiscated because the Electoral Commission said that the long-term observers were not mandated to observe elections on election day. And so when we talk about loopholes, we are saying, if one, we did not have international observers, and then two, there was an accreditation process, which was very strange because people who are asking to be accredited were not accredited. And then even the long-term observers that you gave accreditation, you arrested and took their data on the grounds that they're not accredited to cover election day. Then that becomes problematic for the Electoral Commission, because the question then is, what reports are you relying on? What independent observer reports are you relying on beyond yours to be able to evaluate the process of elections for 2021? Yes, over to you.
Wow. Yeah, our time is fast spent. I think the time I'm remaining with is just allows me to shoot a question per each. Anyway, you want to put something across?
Yes, I just want to put something across. I think we need to, the phrase independent electoral commission does not mean that the commission is independent. And the phrase independent election observer does not mean that the observer is independent. I think that and I'm trying to study some of the reports, and which I want to encourage people to look at. To look at the reports that were being issued by civil society, by all these other players regarding the elections. And you do an independent analysis on whether an independent analysis of these independent reports.
Yes.
And to see whether these reports had crossed the line, or you can suspect that they are part of shaping a narrative. I think what we saw is that while the commission had even backtracked on some of the people it had been working with, is that for the last 1 year to the elections, so many people got into shaping narratives. You would say, I'm not saying this is what was happening, but I can give an example. You would come as an observer, purposely to collect evidence to support your narrative. Now, if that is visible and the commission can suspect that these so-called observers are just shaping one narrative of this side, we are going to have these challenges. These may not be stated reasons, but when you do the analysis, why would the commission withdraw people it has been working with? What is the nature of their reports? How has been the engagement between the commission and these independent observers? I think that at one point as civil society, we also need to reflect on what role we want to play. If we want to play the activist role, if we want to play the facilitative role, if we want to play that independent role, being an independent observer in Uganda is very difficult, because sometimes you have to say this is good when everybody wants you to say everything is bad.
It is bad.
So it's very difficult.
True.
And I think we also need to have a reflection. Currently, I'm trying to look at all these reports that were being issued regarding the elections to find out what was the message. Were they part of the narrative, or were they trying to bring out the reality? And I think this is where we have had the biggest challenge.
All right. I'm really running out of time, but the discussions are very interesting. I think I will stretch by an extra 3 or 4 minutes just to handle one question around. We know one of the things that really shaped these 2020 elections. I need to bring back the issue of the violence that we saw. Although Henry believes that violence is not something that we can look at as having had a big impact on the electoral outcomes, but we all know what happened is around November, where we lost about 54. That's the official number. There are other numbers that are being fronted. 54 people who died during those riots. But we also saw a number of, towards close to the elections, at that point, drones became very popular in picking people that were suspected to be belonging to the opposition. Also, I think on the eve of the elections, we see internet blackout. My good friend here, Isabella, wasn't able to vote. All these things, including and I'll wrap this up with the continued shrinking civic space. We also see shortly after the actions of government on DGF. What lessons do we draw from? Can we really discount the role of security forces in actually determining the electoral outcomes before the actual voting day? And then, how do we move forward? How does the country move forward from this? How do we collect ourselves, heal, but also address the same issues that seem to be coming up to make our electoral process lack integrity? I'll start with Isabella, because those are conclusive, but it's a bit heavy for you to handle, but I know you can handle.
Okay, so no, and I'll just conclude by saying that when we talk about violence is not just physical violence. So you cannot say that you can't measure outcomes on elections using the physical violence threshold. We must recognize the emotional violence, which is usually much more manifested than the physical violence. We must also measure the economic violence. So you're looking at what will happen, for example, to your businesses or anything, if within that context. And so when we talk about the impact that violence had on elections, it is important that we do not forget the emotional role that it played. And until we measure the emotional role, I don't think it's fair to use just the physical violence as a yardstick for the results that we saw in the elections. And I actually think that emotionally, there was a lot of emotional blackmail on the citizens. But again, we can't measure it, but we also can't understate it. Thank you.
Okay, to you, Henry, and also as you answer that, also try to locate there the role of how the commercialized electoral politics probably could have pushed people to consider this to be a do or die affair.
Well, I'll start with the easy one.
Yeah.
After 2016, we did a study to find out how people are spending money. And we realized that spending money is, election is the Christmas season. Everybody can tell you, everybody can get a minimum of a certain amount of money. So it's a culture, it's a vote of no confidence in the leadership, that people now think that unless you give them now, you can never get anything from you. And this is a culture that has gone on. People are overspending just to get into elections, and could also point to the growing corruption, because when you spend so much money, you have to use your position to get that money back with some profits. So that culture is also a vote of no confidence in the leadership. On security, I think we have 3 things that we have to look for. One is that the security forces have the duty to protect the whole process. The security forces can influence the structure. They can have the structural influence where everything is being interpreted by the RDC and the DPC. They don't know people who understand where the risks are. So we have the structural problems that the security can become a structural problem. We can have structural violence because of their behavior. But also the nature of the Ugandan body politic, that this is a society that believes in force, or that believes in change should come at whatever cost. It puts the security forces in a position of anticipating what can happen. So some of the reactions of the security forces we have seen have largely been driven towards protecting the regime in the event that the people want to overrun, and it will have the constitution to back up their positions. Instead, the constitution does not allow us to allow this kind of behavior. So it is an area that we need to have consensus as a country, as the political elite. What would compromise the security of Ugandans in an election? Why would people fear to die in an election? Why? I mean, people should be celebrating that an election has come. There is no fear for dying. But the fact that, what are those security concerns in Uganda that come around election times? When we had all this kind of uprising elsewhere and blah, 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 and those uprising influencing our internal elections, and the narratives that have been shaped by government that this election is being driven by foreigners and what have you, how does that shape the interpretation of security concerns in an election? These are things we have not dealt with, and we have always taken on to the very simple one: the soldiers on the streets, there are soldiers here, and they have blocked so and so, and they have shot so and so. But I think that the role of security is quite wide, which we must study, and we must study it with an idea that we must look for a solution. Security has a role to safeguard this country. Security has a role to safeguard our democracy. Security has a role to safeguard these political processes. And we must find a formula on how this role is being played. If we do not find the formula collectively, the people defining the formula of security will define it based on their own interests. And by and large, that will be regime interest. It will not take us very far.
Okay, there you have it. We cannot extend it from here. That was the Executive Director, Dialogue and Democracy Training Center, Henry Kasacca, part of the discussion. I also had Isabella Akiteng, who is the managing partner for FEMFORT. We were taking a reflection of the 2021 elections and taking stock and audit. Probably these discussions at some point, we will revisit them and see how then can we move forward as a country, because I think we are still polarized. We've not yet necessarily fully recovered from the events of the 2021 elections. Felix Kafuma was your host and moderator for the show. Thank you for being part of this discussion, and bye-bye. Wish you a best week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The monster of money politics is eating up Uganda's democracy. When you take money from a candidate, it means you are feeding the monster. Then you become a part of the problem. When a candidate who overspends on campaigns is elected, he or she will not represent voters but himself. He or she will engage in corruption to recover campaign money. Social services will not be delivered and the voter will suffer more. Voter, let's be wise. Give democracy a chance. Do not sell your vote. Focus on the issue.